Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
The prior 3 weeks, I've spoke at length about the theology and the ethics of James Luther Adams and his concept of the 5 stones. If this is the first time you're hearing about it, real briefly, I'm going to try to catch you up in a few sentences. He was one of our Unitarian theologians who was physically active in trying to stave off the rise of Nazism in Germany before he moved back to the States and became a public theologian at Harvard Divinity School. I'm going to be working through each one of these stones and, in short, around why they call them stones. This was the original metaphor in the Jewish scripture for David and Goliath, and how those 5 stones David used in a sling in modern language to combat oppression. After today, next Sunday will be the last one to cover, but today I'm going to focus on the 4th stone in Adam's theology. That precept, paraphrased again, each child that's born is another redeemer. We are all potential sources of good in the world, and each have a role to play. Goodness happens in relationships with one another. Each child that's born is another redeemer. In the first 3, we were looking at how his teachings were helping us to struggle with all the aspects of the rise of Nazism, and it's as accurate today with all the rise of the alt-right and fascism in our country and abroad. And we've looked at the broader oppressions, which are intrinsic to fascism, to white supremacy. And we looked at the second sermon, a little bit about community. How does everyday community teach us and nurture us as institutions and neighborhoods to not fall prey to propaganda? And this week, we're going to be looking at another aspect of fascism that's intrinsic to it, misogyny. It goes part and parcel, power over rather than power with. The point of oppression, the point of fascism is to get away with, is to bully, is to make a point of showing that you can get away with a thing. I want to start out with a story, like I've done with each one of these sermons, and then we'll get back into the ethics. When I was a child, one of the worst insults another kid could make toward a boy was to say they acted like a girl, or threw like a girl, or ran or walked like a girl. Man up would mean toughen up. Being a guy meant being strong and loud and taking up space. And the barbs would come from boys for sure, but those barbs would also come from girls. It would be ingrained by implicit actions, by adult men and by adult women. As kids, we would voice aloud the stuff that we would quietly live by as adults later, maybe. It's communal sickness. It's a sickness in our culture that strives to denigrate half of our population, at least, in order to apparently lift up the other half. But it only does so in appearance. When boys and men are raised to think masculinity has only one form, we box in our boys' potential, our kids' potential, as we diminish the worth of our girls. No one wins, everyone loses. The pain is merely felt differently for each of us, but the pain is real, and many of us carry that, if not all of us, throughout the rest of our lives. And although we're all diminished, girls' and women's safety is put up as the gamble. And we see this like clockwork in the politics of today with the rise of alt-right and fascism. The first targets are women and other vulnerable communities, people of color, our trans communities. And Adams reminds us that goodness happens in relationships with one another. Each child that's born is another redeemer. And it continues well on into adulthood. The worst excesses get normalized as harmless. Locker room talk, we've heard that over and over our whole lives, but particularly in the last 6 years, when what is actually being bantered about amounts to sexual assault. But people will feel confident, some people, to say out loud that that's just locker room talk. And we don't have to go to that stream to see it in our daily lives, at work or out and about. Take note who takes up room in discussions. Note how we are trained and raised to speak or not to speak. Who gets to repeat the same tired point over and over until folks are beaten into submission, and who struggles to whisper their view even once. Misogyny is a sickness, and it's part and parcel with fascism, and it's part and parcel with white supremacy. And we're swimming in it. We're swimming in it so that some of us normalize it, some never notice it, and some are being killed by it. We're living in a culture where several women can accuse a public or political figure of sexual assault, and a mainstream media pundits will punish them by tweeting out the woman's home address and phone number. And this is a difficult topic to talk about. And as we're going to see this ramping up more and more in our political cycles in the next 6 months, I think it's important periodically to say it out loud so that the normal horribleness doesn't become ingrained in the status quo any more than it already is. If we wonder why some women do not speak out loud in a timely manner after the worst happens, we only have to look to that, the doxing, the revealing whose people's identities are in their home, as one reason among many. And we're seeing it worse than now as our social media platforms are taking off the third rail. They're allowing anyone to say or do whatever they want to someone, and they're even threatening to remove blocking so that someone could be stalked on social media. How traumatic that is for the victim, and how traumatic that is for anyone watching it, especially women, especially others who have been victimized, regardless of gender. And each of those victims and each of those folks that relate to that are put in their place once again. The point of fascism is to show you have power over and not with. So you do the thing. The point of the thing is the ridicule, not the action. It's a sickness, it demoralizes and victimizes, and sometimes it kills. And we have to remember that goodness happens in relationships with one another. Each child that's born is another redeemer. We are not by nature powerless, but some of the dominant paradigms try to teach us that we're powerless. Theologically, to lean into the Christian side of our tradition, misogyny is another form of original sin. We don't need to have done anything to be infected by it. Men, women, all people raised in our culture must deal with its imprint on our psyches and our souls. We're born into it, infected by it in the air, and live lives that replicate the systems of abuse if we're not critical, knowingly or unwittingly, even as many of us are victims of it, because we're all victims of that. But even if we've done nothing to deserve the sin of misogyny, in order for healing, we need to address it. For some of us, we're victims, and a whole range of support systems may need to be relied on for healing, for safety, for justice. And if that's true for you and you need help, please reach out to Reverend Peggy, our senior minister, Brother Zachary, or myself. And I guess I should say for myself, in a broader context, although I've not been a victim of the kind of assault we're talking about, I grew up young and gay and got gay bashed 20 or 30 times in my life. So it's a heavy conversation, and I think it's important that we as a community don't allow what's happening out there to become a normal in how we see the day-to-day. And some of us have internalized it so much that we contribute without knowing the damage we do, in some ways large, in some ways small. If I go back to my childhood, being a guy meant being strong, and I wasn't, and loud, and I wasn't, and taking up space, and I didn't. The flip side meant that being a girl meant being weaker and being a dormouse. And thankfully that image is radically changing as our role models are radically changing on who's allowed to be a role model in our space, all shapes and sizes. When we find ourselves living by either of those false truths, that a boy is a certain way, a girl is a certain way, we need to seek to push ourselves to break free from that bind, even if the person saying it isn't ourselves to ourselves. Binding lies break our spirits, harm our world, and risk our lives. And for the men in the room, and for those that this applies to, we all can do better. We need to be a little more believing of women who say they're in danger. We need to be a little more gracious with the space we dominate. We need to be less permissive of supposed locker room talk when we hear it. Women become less safe and men become less human. And we pretend that language that perpetuates this kind of assault is harmless in our personal fantasies. It's not harmless, and it doesn't further the peace, and it doesn't make space for women, and not only women, to be themselves without fear of harm. Goodness happens in relationships with one another. Each child that's born is another redeemer. If we look back to last week's sermon, we were talking so much about covenant, about how mutuality and community requires consent, and that's a foundation to this next. It creates a space to imagine that every child that's born could be another redeemer. We need to create those safer spaces so that we can all flourish. What does that mean theologically for our culture? If every child that's born is another redeemer, then misogyny is a lie. We're not better than any other soul because of the happenstance of our birth. Any ethic that lifts one group up over another is a spiritual lie that erodes our conscience and diminishes our humanity. Each girl that's born is another redeemer, and we ought to treat one another appropriately with care and support. Our common humanity is wrapped up in the common redemption of all people. Each of us has the potential to redeem the broken corners of our world. That is another way of talking about the beloved community that we recite at the beginning of every service. And we're soon coming upon the Jewish high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur next month. Throughout the Jewish religious life, these holy days teach us wisely to admit our failings, and atone for the harm we've brought into this world, and I'm not connecting that to someone being a victim of assault. I'm talking about some wisdom that those holidays remind all of us here. How we harm through our actions or lack or inaction. There's a teaching that comes from an 18th century Hasidic proverb. Keep two truths in your pocket and take them out according to the need of the moment. Let one be, for my sake, the world was created. For my sake, the world was created. And the other, I am dust and ashes. The wisdom speaks to us based on where our ego and where our sense of self lie. When we're allowing the world to step on us, if we even have the power to stop it, and destroy our sense of worth, which we have the power to hold on to our sense of worth. We need to remember that for our sake, the world was created. For your sake, the world was created. When we're doing this, the soul crushing of another, we need to find more humility and remember that we're dust and ashes. And misogyny confuses the world into thinking those two proverbs apply distinctly based on gender. And that is the opposite of the intent of the message. As if the world were created only for men and women were but dust and ashes. And that is messaging that has lasted so long. And if that feels extreme, take a closer look at how men and women are spoken of in the general public, I don't have to give examples of that on the schoolyard, in your work meetings. And I don't think that's far off how culture functions at its worst. And it functions at its worst far too often. But if each child that's born is another redeemer, if we each have worth and we each have a saving agency to bring to creation, then that potential for goodness is inherent. And we're creating communities to heal our wounds and to raise the next generation and the next generation in that truth. The potential for goodness also obligates us in the face of a world full of struggle. If we have agency, goodness obligates us to use that agency for the betterment of one another. To do otherwise is to turn our heads from another's needs, to be complicit in systems of oppression and indifference that churn through the lives of our children and adults and through our own lives. The demand this fourth stone places upon us is the perennial question: do I live into this holy work? At times of hardship, it may be enough simply to just survive or to just heal, and only you know that. But when we have the capacity to ease the suffering of those around, goodness obligates us to live into this holy work. At those times of strength, living into this holy work means taking seriously when another speaks up about violence or coercion done to them. And to be sure, when we're going through those times of hardship, living our authentic self is the first movement toward living into this holy work. Amen, and blessed be